On August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton passed away at the age of 80. But just 4 days before her death, Dolly Parton quietly warned about something that almost no one noticed. What was it? And why does that warning suddenly seem so important when we look back at the final months of her life? For decades, Dolly gave away more than just money. She gave away an entire fortune. She sent hundreds of millions of books to children. And behind that radiant smile, the music, and the fame, Dolly spent the final years of her life doing something that almost no one ever saw. Why would a woman who had everything choose to devote her life to that? And could her final warning reveal a side of Dolly Parton that today's tributes are overlooking? This is the part of Dolly's story that deserves to be heard, because the final chapter of her life was not really about fame. It was about a warning that may directly affect more than 63 million Americans today. So listen until the very end. Part 2. From a poor Tennessee girl to the queen of country. Long before Dolly Parton became a global superstar, she was simply a little girl growing up in the mountains of East Tennessee. Her childhood was far removed from the world of fame, wealth, and glamorous stages that would later become her reality. Dolly grew up in rural Appalachia in a large family, surrounded by brothers and sisters, in a tiny home where money was always scarce. Life was not easy. There were no guarantees, no powerful connections, and no wealthy family waiting to open doors for her. But there was something Dolly had from the very beginning: music. Music was woven into the life of her family and community. It became a way to express emotions, tell stories, and hold on to hope even when life was difficult. And Dolly quickly discovered that she had a remarkable gift, not only for singing, but for writing songs. One detail from her childhood would stay with her for the rest of her life. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a hard-working man who had never been given the opportunity to learn how to read or write. Dolly saw firsthand how deeply that limitation affected his life. It wasn't simply about being unable to read a book. It represented opportunities that had been closed before he ever had the chance to reach them. Could that experience have helped shape Dolly's lifelong belief that education could change a person's future? Years later, it certainly became one of the driving forces behind some of her greatest acts of generosity. But before Dolly could give books to millions of children, she first had to build a life for herself. She entered the music world with almost nothing except her talent, determination, and an extraordinary ability to turn personal experiences into songs that other people could feel. Her songwriting became one of her greatest strengths. She could take heartbreak, poverty, love, family, faith, and ordinary life and transform them into stories that connected with millions. And that was only the beginning. Dolly Parton didn't remain simply a country singer. Over the course of roughly 6 decades, she became a songwriter, recording artist, actress, businesswoman, and philanthropist. She crossed boundaries that many performers never managed to cross. She could stand on a country stage, appear in Hollywood films, build businesses, create theme park attractions, and still remain deeply connected to the Appalachian girl she had once been. That may be one of the most remarkable things about Dolly. Success never completely erased where she came from. Instead, she seemed to carry that past with her. The little girl who knew what poverty felt like became a woman who understood the value of opportunity. The daughter of a father who could not read became the founder of a literacy program that would eventually put hundreds of millions of books into the hands of children. Her wealth became a tool, her fame became a platform, and her personal experiences became lessons that she could pass on to others. That is why Dolly Parton's place in American culture became so unusual. She wasn't remembered only for her voice or her songs. She became a symbol of resilience, generosity, ambition, and the belief that someone can come from almost nothing and still build something enormous. But there is a painful irony hidden inside that extraordinary life. Dolly spent decades taking care of other people. She helped children discover the joy of reading. She supported families in crisis. She gave opportunities to people who needed them. She built a legacy around helping others. And eventually, in the final chapter of her own life, she would devote herself to caring for the person she had loved for decades. Yet the woman who had spent so much of her life caring for millions of others would face a question that is far more difficult than success. Who takes care of the person who is always taking care of everyone else? That question would become one of the most important and most heartbreaking parts of Dolly Parton's final story. Part 3. The Man Behind Dolly, Carl Dean and a nearly 60-year love story. In 1964, an 18-year-old Dolly Parton arrived in Nashville with a dream, a suitcase, and almost no money. She had come to Music City because she believed she could build a future through music. But she could never have known that, during those first uncertain days, she was about to meet the man who would remain beside her for nearly 6 decades. His name was Carl Dean. Their first meeting was remarkably ordinary. Dolly was doing her laundry at a laundromat when Carl happened to see her. He stopped and spoke to her, and what caught Dolly's attention wasn't fame, money, or status. Carl wasn't a musician looking for a connection to the entertainment business. He was simply a young man living an ordinary life. And perhaps that was exactly what made their relationship so unusual. Dolly was entering a world where everyone wanted something from her. People would eventually want her voice, her songs, her photographs, her interviews, her attention, and eventually, a piece of the celebrity surrounding her. Carl was different. He wasn't part of Hollywood. He wasn't part of Nashville's entertainment industry, and he had no apparent interest in becoming famous himself. 2 years after they met, Dolly and Carl married in 1966 in a small ceremony in Georgia. At the time, Dolly was still at the beginning of what would become an extraordinary career. Neither of them could have known just how dramatically her life was about to change. Dolly would eventually become one of the most recognizable entertainers in America. Her songs would travel around the world. Her voice would become instantly recognizable. She would appear in major films, build businesses, receive countless awards, and become one of the most beloved figures in American popular culture. But Carl remained almost completely outside that world. He rarely appeared at public events, he avoided interviews, he stayed away from the spotlight, and he never seemed interested in using Dolly's fame to create a public identity of his own. That decision became one of the defining characteristics of their marriage. Imagine what it must have been like. One person in the relationship becomes famous almost everywhere she goes, while the other chooses to remain almost invisible. How do you protect a marriage when millions of strangers feel as though they know one half of the couple? How do you maintain something private when the entire world is constantly asking questions about your personal life? For Dolly and Carl, perhaps the answer was separation between public life and private life. Dolly belonged to the world when she stepped onto the stage, but when the cameras disappeared, Carl was simply Carl. He knew the woman behind the celebrity, the woman who had grown up poor, the songwriter who could spend hours creating music, the wife who needed someone who wasn't impressed by fame. And that may explain why Carl became such an important anchor in Dolly's life. He wasn't competing with her success. He wasn't trying to stand in front of her. He was simply there. Even some of Dolly's most famous creative work carried traces of their personal life. Her song, Jolene, for example, was inspired by a real situation involving a woman who showed interest in Carl. His love of rock music also influenced Dolly's later musical projects. Their relationship was not a perfect fairy tale. No marriage lasting decades is. But through the enormous changes in Dolly's career, Carl remained the person connected to the life she had built before worldwide fame changed everything. For nearly 59 years, they shared a life that the public could never fully see. And then, as Carl grew older, something began to change. The woman who had spent decades performing for millions of people was about to step into her most demanding role yet. Not as a singer, not as an actress, not as a businesswoman, but as a caregiver. And this time, there would be no applause, no stage lights, and no audience. There would only be Dolly, Carl, and the quiet reality of what happens when the person you have loved for most of your life suddenly needs you more than ever. Part 4. When the strongest woman in the room became a caregiver. For most of her life, Dolly Parton had been the person who kept moving forward. She had survived poverty. She had built a career from almost nothing. She had faced rejection, criticism, exhaustion, and the enormous pressure that came with becoming one of America's most recognizable entertainers. But as Carl Dean grew older, and his health began to decline, Dolly entered a completely different chapter of her life. She became his caregiver. Suddenly, the world that had surrounded Dolly for decades no longer mattered as much. The concerts, the awards, the cameras, the business meetings, and the bright lights of entertainment became secondary to something much more personal. Was Carl okay? Was he comfortable? Was he safe? Did he need something? Was his health getting worse? These questions can slowly take over the mind of someone caring for a loved one. And perhaps that is what makes caregiving so difficult to explain to people who have never experienced it. There may be no dramatic moment when a person suddenly realizes, "I have become a caregiver." Instead, it happens gradually. One appointment becomes two. One medication becomes several. One sleepless night becomes another. A person's daily schedule begins revolving around someone else's needs. And because the person being cared for is someone you love, the sacrifices don't always feel like sacrifices in the beginning. You simply do what needs to be done. You cancel a plan because your loved one needs you. You postpone an appointment because there is no one else available. You stay awake a little longer because you're worried. You tell yourself you'll rest tomorrow. But what happens when tomorrow keeps getting postponed? That is where caregiver burnout can begin. The caregiver's mind can enter a constant state of alertness. Instead of thinking only about today, they begin anticipating what could go wrong next. What if something happens during the night? What if the next appointment brings bad news? What if they fall? What if their condition suddenly changes? The caregiver can become so focused on preventing problems for someone else that their own needs slowly disappear from the list. And this is where Dolly's story becomes particularly powerful. According to the script, as Carl's health deteriorated, Dolly devoted herself deeply to his care. Her attention became centered on his comfort and safety, while her own health gradually moved into the background. She was not necessarily ignoring herself because she didn't care about her own life. Quite the opposite. She was doing it because she cared so deeply about someone else's. That is the paradox of caregiving. Love can make sacrifice feel natural, and sometimes that makes it difficult to recognize when sacrifice has gone too far. For someone like Dolly, there was another layer of pressure. She had spent her entire life being known as the strong one, the woman who could perform, the woman who could create, the woman who could run businesses, the woman who could solve problems. But even the strongest person has limits. A human body still needs sleep. A human mind still needs rest, and a caregiver still needs care. When those needs are repeatedly ignored, exhaustion can become more than simply feeling tired. It can affect emotional well-being, physical health, relationships, and the ability to continue providing care. That is why Dolly's experience raises one question that reaches far beyond celebrity. When you spend all your strength taking care of the person you love, who takes care of you? For Dolly, that question would become painfully important. Because after years of putting Carl's needs first, she eventually acknowledged that she had allowed her own health to fall behind. And that revelation would give her final chapter a meaning far deeper than the story of a famous woman growing old. It became a warning that love does not make us invincible, a warning that caring for someone else should never mean completely disappearing ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, a warning to millions of ordinary people who are quietly doing exactly what Dolly did, putting someone they love first, day after day, while telling themselves that their own needs can wait. But sometimes, later comes much sooner than we expect. Part 5. Carl's death in 2025, the empty space Dolly could not fill. On March 3, 2025, Carl Dean died at the age of 82. For most people, that date would have marked the end of a long marriage. But for Dolly Parton, it meant something much deeper. Carl had been part of her life for nearly 6 decades. He had known her before the fame, before the millions of records, before the awards, before the world knew her name. He had known Dolly when she was simply an 18-year-old girl arriving in Nashville with a dream. And now, suddenly, he was gone. What does a person do when someone who has been part of almost every chapter of their adult life is no longer there? For Dolly, the answer could not simply be to move on. She continued working. She continued writing music. She continued appearing in public. She tried to keep moving forward, just as she had done throughout her life. But grief does not always disappear simply because life continues. Sometimes it becomes part of the silence between ordinary moments. A familiar chair is suddenly empty. A routine disappears. A phone call that once happened naturally never comes again. And after decades of sharing a life with someone, even the smallest parts of a normal day can suddenly feel unfamiliar. Dolly spoke openly about the loneliness that followed Carl's death. She had lost not only her husband, but the person who had been beside her since the earliest days of her extraordinary journey. Yet there was another realization waiting beneath that grief. For years, Dolly had focused so intensely on Carl's health and well-being that her own health had gradually slipped into the background. She later acknowledged that she had not paid enough attention to herself during that period. Doctor's appointments could wait. Warning signs could wait. Rest could wait. Her own needs could wait. Carl came first. And perhaps that is what makes this part of her story so painful. Because Dolly's sacrifice came from love. She wasn't walking away from her responsibilities. She was walking toward them. She wanted the person she had loved for decades to be safe and cared for. But eventually, the caregiver can become exhausted too. And when the person being cared for is gone, the caregiver may suddenly discover just how much of their own strength they had been spending. This is where researchers sometimes discuss something known as the widowhood effect. The term describes the increased health risks that can sometimes occur after the death of a long-term spouse, particularly among older adults. Grief can disrupt sleep, appetite, routines, social connections, and emotional stability. For someone who has already experienced years of stress or caregiving, the transition can be especially difficult. But there is an important distinction. The widowhood effect does not mean that losing a spouse automatically causes a surviving partner to become seriously ill or die, and it cannot, by itself, explain what happened to Dolly. Her death should not be reduced to a single theory without reliable medical evidence. What it does provide is a framework for understanding why the period after a spouse's death can be physically and emotionally vulnerable. And Dolly's story makes that reality impossible to ignore. For decades, she had been the person giving music, giving money, giving books, giving opportunities, giving comfort. And then, when Carl needed her most, she gave him something even more personal: her time, her energy, her attention, her strength. But how much had it cost her? That is the question that makes her final years so haunting. Because the woman who had spent her entire life helping other people eventually discovered something many caregivers learn too late. You can love someone completely and still become exhausted. You can be strong and still need help. You can devote yourself to another person's survival and still have a responsibility to protect your own. After Carl's death, Dolly was left with an enormous emotional void, and with the physical consequences of years spent putting herself second. She had spent nearly 60 years building a life with one person. Now she had to learn how to live in a world without him. And somewhere inside that silence was the message that would become one of the most important lessons of her final chapter. Who takes care of the caregiver when the caregiver has spent years taking care of everyone else? For Dolly Parton, that question was no longer theoretical. It had become personal. And the answer would soon become a warning for millions of people who were quietly living the same story. Part 6. The final warning. I just didn't pay attention to my health. And now we come to the part of Dolly Parton's story that may be the hardest to hear. Because in the final chapter of her life, Dolly herself acknowledged something that many caregivers understand only after it is too late. She had stopped paying enough attention to her own health. After Carl's death, Dolly began speaking more openly about what those difficult years had done to her. She had spent so much time focused on the person she loved that her own needs had gradually moved further and further into the background. In her own words, she had health issues that she had just didn't pay attention to. Think about that for a moment. How could someone as successful as Dolly Parton, someone surrounded by professionals, schedules, doctors, business advisors, and people willing to help, allow her own health to become something she simply put aside? Perhaps the answer is not as complicated as it seems. She was a wife, caring for someone she had loved for nearly 60 years. When someone you love needs you, your own problems can suddenly feel less urgent. You tell yourself you'll deal with them tomorrow. You postpone an appointment. You ignore a symptom. You keep working even when you're exhausted. And then another day passes, then another. Eventually, later can become a habit. That is what makes Dolly's admission so powerful. She wasn't describing a lack of love. She was describing what can happen when love becomes so consuming that you forget you are human too. And yet, even after everything she had been through, Dolly continued trying to move forward. She kept working. She kept thinking about music. She kept looking toward projects she wanted to complete. She still had things she wanted to accomplish. That determination was unmistakably Dolly. For 6 decades, she had built her life around the idea that there was always another song to write, another person to help, another dream to pursue. But this time, there was something different. Her body had its own limits, and no amount of determination could completely erase them. This is where Dolly's story becomes bigger than Dolly Parton, because there are millions of people who live quietly in the same situation. They are caring for a husband or wife. They are looking after an aging parent. They are helping a relative through serious illness. They are raising children while simultaneously worrying about an older family member. And many of them are doing something remarkably similar to what Dolly described. They put themselves last. Not because they don't value their own lives, but because someone else seems to need them more. The caregiver says, "I'll sleep later. I'll see the doctor next week. I'll take care of myself when things calm down." But what if things never calm down? What if the person you're caring for needs you for months or years? How long can one human being continue giving without receiving care themselves? That is the warning hidden inside Dolly's final story. It is not a warning that she knew she was going to die. There is no evidence that Dolly predicted her own death or understood exactly what would happen. The lesson is more human, and perhaps more important. Loving someone does not make you invincible. Sacrificing for someone you love can be beautiful, but sacrificing your health completely can come with a devastating cost. Dolly's experience reminds us that caring for yourself is not selfish. It is part of caring for the person who depends on you. You cannot keep pouring from an empty cup forever. And perhaps that is why her final words about her health deserve to be remembered. Not because they were a prediction, not because they revealed some secret about her death, but because they exposed something millions of caregivers rarely admit. Sometimes the person who looks strongest is the person who most desperately needs someone to ask, "But who is taking care of you?" That may be one of the most important lessons Dolly Parton left behind. She spent her life giving people music, hope, books, opportunities, and kindness. But in the final chapter, her own experience offered something different. A warning, a reminder, and perhaps a final request to anyone caring for someone they love. Don't wait until your own health is gone before you remember that you matter too. Part 7. 63 million silent heroes in the caregiving crisis. Dolly Parton's story may have begun in the spotlight, but the lesson from her final years reaches far beyond Hollywood, Nashville, or the world of country music. Because Dolly was not alone. Across America, tens of millions of people are quietly living a life that looks surprisingly similar to hers. They are caregivers. They are husbands caring for wives, wives caring for husbands, adult children caring for aging parents, parents caring for children with complex needs. And most of them are doing it without a paycheck. The number is staggering. More than 63 million Americans are estimated to be providing unpaid care for someone they love. But behind that number are millions of individual stories. People waking up early to get their children ready for school before checking on an elderly parent. People working a full-time job and then spending the evening preparing meals, managing appointments, organizing medications, or simply making sure someone they love is safe. People trying to keep their careers alive while watching their parents grow older. People looking at medical bills and wondering how they are going to pay for everything. And people going to bed exhausted, knowing that tomorrow will begin the same way. For many caregivers, there is no real separation between their responsibilities. There is work, there are children, there are aging parents, there are medical expenses, there are household responsibilities, and somewhere in the middle of all of it is their own health, usually at the bottom of the list. This is especially difficult for what researchers often call the sandwich generation. These are adults who find themselves caught between two generations that need them at the same time. Their children need help growing up. Their parents need help growing older. And in the middle is one person trying to hold everything together. So why don't these caregivers simply ask for help? The answer may be surprisingly simple. Many caregivers don't even know what to ask for. When someone says, "Let me know if you need anything," it sounds kind. But imagine being completely exhausted. You've spent the entire day working, caring for someone, managing the house, answering phone calls, and worrying about what might happen next. Do you really have the mental energy to stop and create a list of tasks for someone else? Probably not. There is also another problem. Many caregivers feel guilty asking for help. They may believe that caring for a parent or spouse is their responsibility. They may feel that accepting help means they are failing. Or they may simply tell themselves that someone else has bigger problems. So they keep going, and going, and going, until exhaustion becomes normal. That is why support needs to become more specific. Instead of saying, "Call me if you need anything," imagine saying, "I'm bringing dinner on Saturday. I'll pick up your groceries. I can sit with your loved one for a few hours so you can rest. I'll take care of that errand." Those offers are different. They don't require the exhausted caregiver to organize the help. They simply provide it. And sometimes, a few hours of genuine relief can mean more than people realize. This is where Dolly Parton's story becomes so powerful. She wasn't simply a celebrity who experienced a difficult period in her life. She became an example of something millions of ordinary families understand. The person providing the care can become invisible. Everyone sees the patient. Everyone worries about the illness. Everyone asks whether the loved one is doing better. But who asks whether the caregiver is sleeping? Who asks whether they have seen a doctor? Who asks whether they are eating properly? Who asks whether they are overwhelmed? And perhaps most importantly, who takes care of the person who spends every day taking care of someone else? That is the question Dolly's final chapter leaves behind. Her story transforms from a celebrity biography into something much more personal. Because somewhere in America today, there is a daughter sitting beside her aging mother. There is a husband caring for his wife. There is a father trying to balance a job with the needs of his family. There is a son quietly paying medical bills and pretending everything is under control. They may never appear on television. They may never receive an award. And they may never call themselves heroes. But they are doing something extraordinary every single day. They are caring for someone they love. And perhaps Dolly Parton's greatest lesson was not simply to admire generosity, sacrifice, or strength. It was to recognize the people who quietly give all three, and to remember that even the strongest caregiver deserves someone standing beside them. Part 8. Dolly's final legacy, more than music. When we look back at Dolly Parton's extraordinary journey, it is almost impossible to believe how many different lives seem to exist. What began as a simple effort to provide books to children in her home region grew into something extraordinary. Over the years, the program distributed hundreds of millions of books to children, giving young readers something Dolly herself had once understood to be precious: the opportunity to discover a bigger world through education. For Dolly, this was never simply about giving away books. It was about giving children possibilities. A child opening a book could imagine a different future. A family that could not afford books could still give a child the experience of reading. And a young person growing up with limited opportunities could discover that the world was much larger than the circumstances around them. That may be one of the clearest examples of how Dolly transformed her own past into something positive for others. But her legacy cannot be measured only in books. It cannot be measured only in money. And it cannot be measured only by the number of songs she recorded or awards she received. Because Dolly's final lesson was much more human. She showed us that generosity is not only about what you give away. Sometimes it is about the time you give, the attention you give, the care you give, and the sacrifices you make for someone you love. But her final years also revealed the other side of that equation. The person who gives care needs care too. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside Dolly Parton's final chapter. For decades, the world saw a woman who seemed almost unstoppable. She performed, she created, she built businesses, she helped children, she supported families, she made people laugh, she made people cry. She gave millions of people a reason to smile. But behind that extraordinary strength was still a human being. A woman who could become tired. A woman who could experience grief. A woman who could feel lonely. And a woman who, while caring for the person she loved most, could forget to care for herself. That contrast is what makes her final years so deeply moving. Dolly spent her entire life making other people smile. Yet in the final years of her life, she showed us that behind even the strongest smile can be a human being quietly running out of strength. Perhaps that is why her story should not end simply with a list of achievements. It should end with a question. Not about how many records she sold, not about how much money she earned, not about how famous she became, but about what we do with the people around us. Because somewhere today, there may be a caregiver sitting quietly beside someone they love. They may be exhausted, they may be worried, they may be pretending everything is fine, and they may not know how to ask for help. So if Dolly Parton's life taught us anything, perhaps it is this. Don't wait for someone to tell you they need help. Look closer, listen more carefully, and remember that the strongest person in the room may be the one who needs someone else to stand beside them. If we truly want to remember Dolly Parton, perhaps the best thing we can do is not simply listen to her songs again. Perhaps it is to notice the person quietly caring for someone they love and ask them one simple question. Are you okay today? Because sometimes, those 3 words can become the greatest gift we give.